Humans have a long history of holding leaders up as something more than simply human. Whether or not you are comfortable with calling that a cult following is up to you. I have no problem with national heroes or looking up to others as role models, but I am here to say that these people are just human. They had flaws, they made mistakes, and to the best of our knowledge, they lived and died just like every other human that has ever lived and died. Welcome to Division 1 of what I'm calling the Deification and Supremacy Tournament, which includes Deified Rulers, as well as Buddhas, Messiahs, and Mahdis. I wanted to show you the source and spend a little time defining and reviewing how this list came about before we get started. This is the tournament here, pretty much it's going to be Wikipedia, and I'll put the links in the description. So I covered deification in part 4, Folklore of the History of Reality 101, and this whole tournament series just kind of came out of that series. And I've talked a little bit about that in the previous tournament and in the channel update, which was just released a few days ago. But yeah, this is the main source right here, not only this page. So of course I've also included Jewish messiahs and Buddhas and Mahdis, which is the basically Muslim messiah. And I'm going to cover all those definitions in a second, but I also wanted to show you, I talked about this spreadsheet in earlier videos as well. And so I just wanted to show you it and cover it a little because it's actually, I've put all these into this one spreadsheet, all the Messiah claimants, Mahdis, Buddhas, rulers, and so I'm actually pulling from this spreadsheet now. But what I've done, I've put them in here, and I've just kind of, I came up with several categories. Obviously, Buddha is one. I started with the first category, which is kind of a deified ruler, and I've actually distinguished that from a national hero. And of course, some of this is going to be debatable, and I'm definitely not saying this list is complete. I've added to it, especially in the case of the Jesus claims. I've gone to other sources and I've added to that one. Also, just personality cults. That's another category that I've added on here. That's actually the next tournament is going to cover that. So the reason I've combined rulers, Buddhas, messiahs into one tournament is because pretty much I needed 64. So and the number of those that I had pretty much came out to that exactly. There's going to be a surprise contender at the end in the 4th division that doesn't fit into these categories. That's actually one that I missed from the Jesus tournament. So we've got another Jesus claimant that's going to make it onto this tournament at the end. So let's real quick define what a Mahdi is for those of you who are unfamiliar. So in Muslim eschatology, the Mahdi is a messianic figure who it is believed will appear on earth before the day of judgment and will rid the world of wrongdoing, injustice, and tyranny. So it is essentially, like I said earlier, the Muslim Messiah. The Buddha is not just it's not just Gautama, Siddhartha Gautama, the historical founder of Buddhism. We also have people who have claimed to have attained enlightenment and become Buddhas themselves, or manifestations of the Buddha path. It's actually called, or there's actually a figure in some Buddhism sects, the Maitreya Buddha, who is a future Buddha, and it's just Buddhist eschatology. So in that respect, Buddhism is not unlike other religions. And then, of course, the Jewish Messiah, as many of you know. Oh yeah, I did want to mention, so Buddha, you could actually consider that, in Jainism, that would be called a Tirthankara, who is someone who has achieved enlightenment. As remember, in the I guess if you hold the supernatural beliefs of the Eastern religions like Hindu and Jainism and Buddhism, once you've achieved enlightenment, you are essentially, merged with the source, or you become well, that's why they created the Tirthankara. It's like a special type of karma that even though they've achieved enlightenment, they've essentially become one with the universe. They remain on the earth for a while to teach the true path. That is actually the definition of a Tirthankara. Someone who has achieved enlightenment but has stayed on earth to preach the true path. And I covered that in part 6 of the History of Reality 101. Jewish messiahs I got into a little bit in the series. Of course, Jesus being claimed to be the Messiah. He was rejected by Judaism, and we all know that whole story and the history of that. The Messiah in Judaism is originally meant to be a divinely appointed king or anointed one, and included Jewish priests, prophets, and kings such as David, Cyrus the Great, and Alexander the Great. And it should come as no surprise, those are Cyrus and Alexander are contenders in the tournament. I did cover the not only the deification, but in the case of the Chinese emperors, the sons of heaven. And this was, this was pretty widely practiced all over the world, in the ancient world, and continues to this day, which is kind of the point of this tournament. So, without further ado, let's just get right into it. And of course, this is the list that drives, this spreadsheet creates the brackets. So this is the complete list. Here it is in the bracket form. And so let's begin with our first matchup here. Let me zoom in. So our first matchup, we are going with the pharaohs, and specifically Narmer and Naram Sin. And if I'm mispronouncing these, I apologize. But it is what it is. I will skip the ones that I feel like I'm going to struggle with. But let's go ahead and get started with the Egyptian pharaohs. So this practice is going to be the oldest, probably historical, and it's definitely the first on the list. And we all know that the Egyptian kingdom is one of the earliest civilizations. So Narmer has been traced back to about 3150 BCE. He is credited with unifying Egypt and beginning the first dynasty. And Egyptian pharaohs were deified from 3150 BCE, beginning here, all the way until 30 BCE. So on this list, in the tournament, in the deification category, the Egyptian pharaohs have the longest stretch, the longest period in history of being deified. And it actually comes out to 3,100 120 years. So already the Egyptian pharaohs are a strong contender in the first division for the entire tournament. That is going to set the bar. Narmer, meaning painful, stinging, harsh, fierce catfish. This is his crest in hieroglyphs. This is apparently a catfish. This is a chisel. And then the hawk, I'm guessing that means like the higher one or the highest. Some symbol of deification or a king. As I said, he's considered the unifier of Egypt. Same person as Menez, which maybe some of you know the significance of that. I don't. The Egyptian presence in Canaan is best demonstrated by the presence of pottery from Egyptian Nile clay and found in Canaan, as well as pottery made from local clay but in the Egyptian style. The latter suggests the existence of Egyptian colonies rather than just trade. And I put that in there just to show that they have a long history with Canaan and, of course, the Jewish people. And Naram Sin of Mesopotamia, the king of the Akkadian Empire, his reign was from 2254 to 2218, and he is important because he's one of the earliest from the Mesopotamia area, and of course this area it plays a very, very big role in human history. His name means beloved of the moon god. This symbol being honorific for divine. Third successor and grandson of King Sargon. Empire reached its maximum strength. Known to have claimed divinity for himself, taking the title God of Akkad. I know it's Akkadian. I don't know. Claimed to be the king of the four quarters, king of the universe. And of course we know that's certainly not true. We have other examples later on this list that of course made the same claim, and probably have more rights to that claim. But this guy was one of the earliest. This is a quote from him, supposedly. Whereas, for all time, since the creation of mankind, no king whosoever had destroyed Armanam and Abla, the gods Nergal, by means of his weapons, opened the way for Naram Sin, the mighty, and gave the Armanam and Ebla. Whatever. Further, he gave to him the Amanas, the cedar mountain, and the upper sea, by means of the weapons of the god Dagon, who magnifies his kingship. Naram Sin, the mighty, conquered. Okay, so some inscription. Yeah, this was a big thing, just talking about their conquest back in the day and being anointed by various gods. Of course, Dagon. He has history in Canaan, actually. I talked about that in episode, part 8. The Zoroastrian episode in the History of Reality. Okay, yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and do 2 matchups, and then we'll go back to the bracket and fill that out that way. So next up is Queen Dido of Carthage. Founder and first queen of Carthage in 814 BCE. Do not have a information on her life or rule, but she is the first queen of Carthage after her death. She was deified by her people with the name Tanit and assembled to the great goddess Roman Juno. The cult survived Carthage's destruction by the Romans, and it was introduced to Rome itself by Emperor Septimius Severus himself, born in North Africa. It was extinguished completely with the Theodosian decrees of the late 4th century. Dido remains an enduring figure in popular culture, featured in plays, artworks, and other media into the 21st century. Her legacy is especially strong in Tunisia, whose women are sometimes called the daughters of Dido, and where she is regarded as a national symbol, even being previously featured on its currency. And she is Queen Dido is actually one of the first and one of the few females on this list. So, and one of the first in history as well. And Queen Dido will be facing off against the Japanese emperors, and this is going to be a tough one because, beginning with Emperor Jimmu, Japan also had a very long tradition of deifying their emperors, all the way up until the Second World War in 1945. So his rule began in 660 BCE. And that comes out to 2,605 years of practicing deifying their rulers. So Jimmu claimed, at least by some Shintoists, including government officials, so it is official, to be divine descendants of the goddess Amaterasu. Emperors considered divine, like I said, from 660 BCE to 1945. Hirohito, the Showa emperor, repudiated the false conception of his divinity in the Humanity Declaration of 1945. So Jimmu's claim to fame launched military expeditions near Seto Inland Sea, captured Yamato, and established this as his center of power. In modern Japan, Jimmu's accession is marked as a National Foundation Day on February 11th. So this is actually considered the birth of Japan. In Japanese mythology, the Age of the Gods is the period before Jimmu's accession. The story of Jimmu seems to rework legends associated with a Tomo clan and the clan's ruling family. Also some other tales and legends, so in Japanese folklore. So of course, unsurprisingly, I think at this point, this grew out of Japanese folklore. Next up will be the Buddha, but let's try to take this bracket out a little bit. And so let's see. I think, unsurprisingly, the Egyptian pharaohs over the Mesopotamian king, even though he did claim to be the king of the universe. Historically, I don't think he's lived up to his claims. This is a tough one. So do you go with Queen Dido, or do you go with the Japanese, which had a not as long as the Egyptians, but an extremely long run as deifying their rulers? I think we're going to go with Queen Dido in this, simply because she's still revered today. And the Japanese emperor deification claim was repudiated after getting beaten by America in World War II. So yeah, let's just go with that. And should we take this all the way out? I think, again, I'm going to have to go with the Egyptians over Queen Dido. I feel a little bad doing that, being as she's one of the few females on the list. But Going up against the Egyptians, I mean, they're going to be a tournament favorite, I feel. So hopefully you all agree with that. But I am going to go ahead and move on. So our next matchups, let's review what they are. Ooh, we have Buddha and Cyrus the Great, Ezra and Alexander the Great. So wow, this is... we got some very famous and familiar figures coming up. Beginning with the Buddha, also known Siddhartha Gautama, born approximately 480 BCE in the Shakya Republic, died 400 BCE at the age of 80, or some believe, I don't know, he may have ascended, he may have become one with the universe. He was certainly enlightened, we all know that. Believed a god by some Mahayana sects and worshipped as an avatar of Vishnu by some Vaishnavas. After announcing to the Sangha at large that he would soon be passing away to final nirvana, the Buddha ordained one last novice into the order personally. His name was Sabhala. He then repeated his final instructions to the Sangha. I hope I'm not mispronouncing these words. I'm sure that I am. His final instructions were, which was that the Dhamma and the Vinaya was to be their teacher after his death, so he appoints his successors. Then he asked if anyone had any doubts about the teaching, but nobody did. The Buddha's final words are reported to have been, all sankharas mean, which is formations or something that has been put together. All sankharas decay. Strive for the goal with diligence. And of course that means following the path and the Buddhist teachings. He then entered his final meditation and died, reaching what is known as final nirvana, parinirvana, possibly. The end of rebirth and suffering achieved after the death of the body. And the Buddhist faith claims, or today has 488 million followers. The Buddha is unsurprisingly a top contender here. And he is facing off against Cyrus the Great, which I'm sure needs no introduction. He is very, very famous. He's still famous, still a cult figure. His reign was from 559 to 530 BCE. He, of course, is the ruler of the Persian Empire, or the Achaemenid Empire. Commonly known as Cyrus II of Persia, commonly known as Cyrus the Great, also Cyrus the Elder by the Greeks. Founder of the Achaemenid or Persian Empire. The empire embraced all the previous civilized states of the ancient Near East, expanded vastly, and eventually conquered most of Western Asia and much of Central Asia. What is sometimes referred to as the Edict or of Restoration. And I'm just going to go into some of the things that made it famous, especially in the Jewish religion. Referred to as the Edict of Restoration, actually two edicts described in the Bible as being made by Cyrus the Great, left a lasting legacy on the Jewish religion. According to Isaiah 45:1 of the Hebrew Bible, God anointed Cyrus for this task, even referring to him as the Messiah, the anointed one. And he is the only non-Jewish figure in the Bible to be called so. Cyrus the Great is also well recognized for his achievements in human rights, politics, military strategy, as well as influence on both Eastern and Western civilizations. Having originated from Persis, roughly corresponding to the modern Iranian province of Fars. Cyrus has played a crucial role in defining the national identity of modern Iran. The Achaemenid influence in the ancient world would eventually extend as far as Athens, where upper-class Athenians adopted aspects of the culture of the ruling class of Achaemenid Persia as their own. Cyrus is a cult figure among modern Iranians, with his tomb serving as a spot of reverence for millions of people. In the 1970s, the last Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, identified his famous proclamation inscribed onto the Cyrus cylinder as the oldest known declaration of human rights, and the cylinder has since been popularized as such. This view has been criticized by some historians as a misunderstanding of the cylinder's generic nature as a traditional statement that new monarchs make at the beginning of their reign. And yeah, I actually agree with that. If you just look throughout history, this is very common. It's even common in the Bible. Just they first claim themselves as a king from a line of kings. So of course they give their long list of their genealogy, and of course many figures in the Bible try to trace their genealogy all the way back to Adam. That's very common. It's not just common in the Bible. Muhammad or Islam does it, tried it for Muhammad. They make that claim. So it's very common. And it's common across empires. It's common across the world, across history. It's just kind of a thing that they did. It's how they. It's a claim to a royal bloodline, and so it was just in the Japanese emperors. They claim to be descendants of gods. So that's, like I said, it extends all the way back into folklore from tribes, and it just becomes legend, and then it becomes part of your civilization, and then it becomes part of how you rule, and becomes your claim to power. And so again, that's kind of the point of all this. We're just walking through history, and this is just reviewing of how humans have historically built their societies. And these are all claims to supremacy or deification. And without exception, that includes the Jewish faith, of course. One of the earliest messiahs, or major leaders of the Jewish faith, this is Ezra. So established the Second Temple of Judaism and is regarded as a very important figure in Judaism. The Quran claims that a group of Jews, often interpreted as the Yemenite Jews, believed Uzar was the son of God. He's actually mentioned in the Quran 9:30, and the Jews say Ezra is the son of Allah, and the Christians say the Messiah is the son of Allah. That is their saying with their mouths. They imitate the saying of those who disbelieved of old. Allah himself fighteth against them. How perverse are they? And this is the Arabic of that. And this is the source. And I'll try to remember to put this link in the description as well. So Ezra, born 480 to 440. And he's the priest in the book of Ezra, the Jewish scribe Sofer, and priest Cohen. And Ezra is unfortunately facing off against Alexander the Great. So Alexander the Great, the famous king of Macedonia, his reign was from 360 to 323 BCE, a very short 13-year run in which he expanded the empire greatly. Some believe he implied he was a demigod by actively using the title Son of Amun Zeus. The title was bestowed upon him by Egyptian priests of the god Amun at the oracle of the god at the Siwa oasis in the Libyan desert. So Alexander III of Macedon, commonly known as Alexander the Great, King Basilius of the ancient Greek kingdom of Macedon, Macedonia, most people know it as, and a member of the Argead dynasty. Wow. Succeeded his father Philip II to the throne at the age of 20. He spent most of his ruling years on an unprecedented military campaign through Western Asia and Northeast Africa. By the age of 30, he had created one of the largest empires of the ancient world, stretching from Greece to northwestern India. He was undefeated in battle and is widely considered one of history's most successful military commanders. Tutored by Aristotle until the age of 16, succeeded his father and inherited a strong kingdom and an experienced army. Became general of Greece and used his authority to launch his father's project, which was to conquer Persia, which he invaded and began a series of campaigns that lasted 10 years. Following the conquest of Anatolia, Alexander broke the power of Persia in a series of decisive battles, most notably the battles of Issus and Gaugamela. He subsequently overthrew Persian king Darius III and conquered the Achaemenid Empire in its entirety. His legacy includes the cultural diffusion and syncretism which his conquest engendered, such as Greco-Buddhism. He founded some 20 cities that bore his name, most notably Alexandria in Egypt. So, no surprise, Alexander the Great is, of course, going to be a top contender as well. So, right off the bat, we have a lot of difficult matchups. So I am actually going to have to go with Cyrus the Great over the Buddha here. And I know that I said earlier the Buddha had 488 million followers. But Cyrus the Great, he's got a high status in the Jewish faith as well as in the Christian faith. Like evangelical Christians today consider Trump like a Cyrus figure, which is kind of strange because all he did was conquer the Republican Party and win an election. He didn't establish a worldwide empire, but I'm not going to get into that. But the point is, his influence is still just as strong and as widely received as ever. Like I said, he's still got a cult following in Iran as well, and he's known worldwide. So I am giving this to Cyrus the Great, and I think no surprise here, I'm also going to give this to Alexander the Great. And this sets up a very difficult matchup, and this is actually popular among historians. And I read a little bit into some of the arguments that people are making. And there's good arguments on both sides, to be honest. So, Alexander the Great was very young when he was ruler of the empire and conquering. He actually conquered Cyrus's empire. Of course, he didn't defeat Cyrus himself, but it was the empire that he founded that was conquered. Alexander's influence is probably just as great, or nearly just as great. He founded all those cities, the libraries, he expanded Greek knowledge. He he is accused of, well, okay, so let's just say Cyrus is credited for being religiously tolerant, and Alexander is not. He pushed very heavily, like the Greek mythology, such as Zeus. So, in that respect, I would say that that kind of counts against him. And of course, we have no idea what it was like to live under Cyrus the Great, really being a religious minority. But historically, just the reputation is that he was tolerant of religious minorities. So let's see. Alexander's empire is said to have been slightly larger than Cyrus's. He actually did get into Egypt, which Cyrus did not in his lifetime. But I think I've been going with kind of the first. Cyrus, I believe, probably has a greater influence and is, I think, probably so I think all of those stuff combined, and just what I was talking earlier about with Cyrus, I think I'm going to give this to him over Alexander the Great. So that sets up another difficult matchup with Cyrus the Great over the pharaohs, Egyptian pharaohs. But I think, again, here, with the same logic that I used with the previous matchup, I'm going to have to go with Cyrus the Great again. So he moves into the Elite Eight, and he will face off against the winner of the bottom of this first division. So let's get right into that and move on to the next two matchups, which we have this guy of Iberia and the Chinese emperors versus a pair of Antiochuses, Theos and Epiphanes. And I believe this is like Seleucid or sort of Greek empires. So let's jump back over to the profiles here. Pharnavaz the first of Iberia. So he... his rise is directly tied to Alexander the Great and the weakening and destruction of the Achaemenid Empire. He ruled from 326 to 234 BCE, so he had a pretty long reign, actually. This is another inscription that I copied from Georgian Royal Annals page of edition 23, blah, blah, blah. Pharnavaz sent his apostles towards the king Antiochus of Assyria and gave him huge gifts and promised to serve him and asked him for help against the Greeks. And Antiochus received his gifts and called him a son and gave him the crown. Georgian Royal Annals. That's from the Georgian Royal. And gave him the crown. Blah, blah, blah. Upon his death, he was buried in front of the idol Armazi and worshipped. His son, Salarmag, succeeded him to the throne. Pharnavaz's grave is undisclosed so far. One of the last monarchs who visited his grave to adorn it and pay his respects was King Miriam III. His burial in front of idol Armazi suggests a Hellenistic deification of the early monarchs of Iberia. So he makes it on the list because he was a deified ruler. But from this inscription, so he was trying to appease to other rulers, Antiochus. So that's going to count against him, I'm sorry to say. Especially in the supremacy, from the supremacy viewpoint, if he's asking favors of other kings. Moving on now to Chinese emperors, and these are known as as the Sons of Heaven. And I covered this in the Confucianism and Taoism, part 7 of the History of Reality 101 series. So the Sons of Heaven practice continued from 221 BCE, beginning with the Qin dynasty, all the way up until 1911. That is a total of 2,132 years. So that is actually less than the Egyptian pharaohs and Japanese emperors. But still a very long period to hold up a tradition. So the first emperors, Qin Shi Huang, following the Shang and Chao of the ancient era, and established the imperial era. Personal name, Yongzong, perhaps, was the founder of the Qin dynasty and the first emperor of a unified China. He also became China's first emperor when he was 38, after the Qin had conquered all of the other warring states and unified all of China in 221 BCE, rather than maintain the title of king. Born by previous Shang and Chao rulers, he ruled as the first emperor. In 1911, the title of Prime Minister of the Imperial Cabinet was created to rule alongside the emperor as part of an attempt to turn China into a constitutional monarchy. And of course, we all know how that turned out. It wasn't long before the rise of communism and Mao. And of course, now they have still communists, and they have a president for life. He's essentially a dictator now. Moving on to the next matchup, we have our first Antiochus II, also known as Theos, which is a word for God. Beginning 286 to 246 BCE, Basilius, or ruler, emperor of the Seleucid Empire, and his reign was from 261 to 246 BCE. He liberated Ephesus, Ionia, Sicilia, and Pamphylia. I'm sure I'm butchering all of these names. In return for their autonomy, the cities of Asia Minor gave him the title of god. In the aftermath of the Second Syrian War, Antiochus II made peace with the pharaoh Ptolemy II Philadelphus. He divorced Laodice. Oh yeah, this is a cool story. So he divorced his wife and married Ptolemy II's daughter, Berenice, with the understanding that any children born from their union would inherit the Seleucid throne. By 246 BCE, Antiochus had left Berenice and their infant son Antiochus in Antioch to live again with Laodice, so he goes back to his ex-wife in Asia Minor. She took the occasion to poison him, while her partisans at Antioch murdered Berenice and their infant son. He is buried in a mausoleum. So she definitely proved his deification wrong. I would say that. And even went as far as to end his bloodline. What is that saying about hell hath no fury like a woman scorned? And this may be where it came from. Who knows? And he is up against the second Antiochus on this list. There's another one further down. Antiochus IV, also Epiphanes, also a ruler of the Seleucid Empire, ruled from 175 to 164 BCE, up until his death, it looks like. the only Seleucid to claim divine honors, calling himself Theos Epiphanes, or God Manifest, and Nikephoros, bringer of victory, nearly conquered Ptolemaic Egypt, the primary rival of the Seleucids among the Diadochi states. Famously attempted to impose ancient Greek religion on the Jews by persecution, leading to the Maccabean revolt, remembered as a major persecutor in Jewish tradition, which I actually had not heard of him. So much history. According to the authors of the books of the Maccabees, while Antiochus was busy in Egypt, a rumor spread that he had been killed. In Judea, he deposed high priest Jason, gathered a force of 1,000 soldiers, and made a surprise attack on the city of Jerusalem. Menelaus, the high priest appointed by Antiochus, was forced to flee Jerusalem during the riot. King Antiochus returned from Egypt in 168 BCE. Enraged by his defeat, he attacked Jerusalem and restored Menelaus, then executed many Jews. When these happenings were reported to the king, he thought that Judea was in revolt. Raging like a wild animal, he set out from Egypt and took Jerusalem by storm. He ordered his soldiers to cut down without mercy those whom they met and to slay those who took refuge in their houses. There was a massacre of young and old, a killing of women and young children, a slaughter of virgins and infants. In the space of 3 days, 80,000 were lost, 40,000 meeting a violent death, and the same number being sold into slavery. So that, don't piss off this guy. That is definitely some persecution in the span of that short period. So I think he is going to be over the first Antiochus. In this case, we're not going to go with the first, just because this guy was just cut down by his aggrieved wife, ex-wife, and this guy did some major wrath of God stuff. And then, of course, here we're going to have to go with the Chinese emperors over this guy of Iberia. I mean, he was deified by the people that he helped, but then, of course, he was appealing to other kings for help as well. So, to me, that seems to kind of undercut his god status just a little bit. And then in this case, I think we'll have to go with the Chinese emperors over Antiochus IV. Of course, this guy rose to power by unifying all of China. No easy task, obviously. So we will move on to our next two, and that actually will round out the end of Division 1. So let's finish up with these last two matchups. Let's meet our last four contenders. And up next, is this another Antiochus? Yeah, okay, so I had 3 in a row. I didn't realize that. So a popular name in the ancient world, especially in this sort of Greek Seleucid empire areas. He's the king of Commagene. I don't even know what that is. A Greco-Persian. Instituted a cult for himself and several syncretistic Greco-Persian deities at Mount Nimrud and elsewhere. His reign was from 70 to 31 BCE. Interesting. So he actually retired as king before he died. I didn't even realize you could do that. So, this guy, his cult was actually kind of interesting. So I included this little bit about his tomb and the rituals that he instituted. His tomb complex was constructed in a way that religious festivities could occur there. Every month, there were 2 feast days for Antiochus, his birthday, which was celebrated on the 16th, and his coronation, which was celebrated on the 10th. He allocated funds for these events from properties legally bound to the site. He also appointed families of priests and hierodules to conduct the rituals, and their descendants were intended to continue the ritual service into perpetuity. The priests wore traditional Persian robes and adorned the images of the gods and Antiochus' ancestor with gold crowns. The priests offered incense, herbs, and other unspecified splendid sacrifices on altars set before each image. All the citizens and military were invited to the banquets in honor of the illustrious deceased. During the feast, grudging attitudes were forbidden, and Antiochus decreed that the people should enjoy themselves, eat and drink wine, and listen to the sacred music performed by the temple musicians. Antiochus' tomb was forgotten for centuries until 1883, when archaeologists from Germany excavated it. So again, this is just kind of part of how these things come out of folklore, or I guess, I don't know, maybe even better said, this is how folklore begins. It is rulers, leaders, conquerors who have a desire to be remembered and celebrated for all time, into perpetuity. This guy even set up funds and instructions and jobs and dates for all of these rituals, simply to honor him and keep his memory alive. And that, I think, is a pretty much the primary driving factor in a lot of these religious rituals. And well, I mean, not all of them, of course, but a lot of it stems from these figures who just want to be worshipped. That's I mean, that pretty much, I don't know a better way to say it. And of course, that leads perfectly into the next contender on the list, Roman emperors, beginning with, of course, Julius Caesar in 42 BCE. So he lived from 100 to 44, and but sort of the events of his life and just his figure is what led to or what began the deification of Roman emperors. As pretty much the end of the Roman Republic and the beginning of the empire, ruled by a deified figure. So the beginning of deification is supremacy in the Roman Empire. And this is a list of all the Roman emperors include to be considered divine, the son of the divine one. So yeah, again, this the son of heaven idea is not it's not exclusive to Christianity or really any part of the world. It was done in China, it was done in Rome. It's fairly common in the ancient world, and a continuing tradition. So Julius Caesar was the first historical Roman to be officially deified. He was posthumously granted the title Divus Illuius, deified Julius, by decree of the Roman Senate on January 1st, 42 BCE. The appearance of a comet during games in his honor was taken as confirmation of his divinity. Though his temple was not dedicated until after his death, he may have received divine honors during his lifetime, and shortly before his assassination, Mark Antony had been appointed as his priest. Flamen Flamen. I don't know. Both Octavian and Mark Antony promoted the cult of Divus Julius. After the death of Caesar, Octavian, as the adoptive son of Caesar, assumed the title of Son of the Divine. So I'm sure there was no ill intent there, or no self-promotion in promoting the cult of Caesar, knowing that you were going to be his successor. Let's see. Wow, are we on Jesus already? Is that true? Okay, yeah, so the last two matchups includes Jesus and Simon Bar Kokhba. I did not realize Jesus was in the first division here. Okay, so our final matchup of the first division, he needs no introduction. Jesus. Usually said to have lived from 4 BCE to 33 CE. That is kind of the agreed upon historical dates. Some people dispute his existence entirely, but it is, I think, widely agreed at this point that there was a historical figure, an eccentric preacher, if nothing else, as Christopher Hitchens put it. So the Gospel of John, dating from the 1st or 2nd century, reports him as hinting at or claiming to be God in passages such as John 10:30, and this is the English Standard Version, I and the Father are one. And John 14:9, Jesus said to him, have I been with you so long, and you still do not know me, Philip? Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, show us the Father? So yeah, I think you can probably from that verse. And of course, most Christians, fundamentalist Christians would accept that Jesus is God. They are the same, or one part of the Trinity, or whatever it is. So in Islam, I just thought this was kind of a interesting tangent. In Islam, Jesus is the penultimate prophet and Messiah of God, peace be upon him, and the Messiah sent to guide the children of Israel with a new revelation, Injil, or Arabic for gospel. As in the Christian New Testament, the Quran describes Jesus as the Messiah, born of a virgin, performing miracles accompanied by disciples rejected by the Jewish establishment and being raised to heaven. The Quran differs in denying Jesus was crucified or died on the cross, and especially in rejecting the divinity of Jesus as God incarnate, or the Son of God. So, I just thought I'd throw that in there. No surprise, not everyone agrees on Jesus' divinity. Even theists, even the religious. And it's important to keep that in mind, I think. Jesus is facing off against another Jewish Messiah, or Jewish Messiah claimant, Simon Bar Kokhba. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Bar Kokhba was hailed as Messiah King by Rabbi Akiva, who referred to him by using numbers XX1517. His messiahship was doubted by some, but Bar Kokhba led a rebellion and founded a short-lived Jewish state, so rebelling against the Roman Empire. He was killed in the siege of Betar, which was the final battle of the Third Jewish-Roman War that devastated Judea. Died in 135 at the end of that revolt. He was a ruthless leader, punishing any Jew who refused to join his ranks. According to Eusebius Chronicon, he severely punished the sect of Christians with death by different means of torture for their refusal to fight against the Romans. And most, or many, I'm assuming most Christians at this time would have been Jewish still. So it was kind of a different, it was basically still a primarily Jewish sect at that point that had split, the followers of Jesus. So they were in a disagreement with the followers of Simon, who, by the way, fit the idea of the Jewish Messiah much better than Jesus, simply because he led this revolt and actually established a state, even though it didn't last very long. That was still more in line with the Jewish idea of the great conqueror, of the anointed one, the Messiah. According to a legend during his reign, I thought this was kind of interesting. Bar Kokhba was once presented a mutilated man who had his tongue ripped out and his hands cut off, unable to talk or write. The victim was incapable of telling who his attackers were. Thus, Bar Kokhba decided to ask simple questions, in which the dying man was able to nod or shake his head with his last movements. The murderers were consequently apprehended. In Hungary, this legend spawned the Bar Kokhba game, in which one of two players comes up with a word or object, while the other must figure it out by asking questions, only to be answered with yes or no. And I'm sure all of us have played this game at one point in time in our lives. And this, so I don't know, this is kind of claiming to be possibly the origin of that, or at least the origin of that in that region. And I thought that was kind of interesting, just reading up a little bit about this guy. And I try to throw in little interesting facts, go on little sidebars there. So I think we have enough information now to move on with these last two matchups. Here, I think, no surprise, we're going to have to go with Jesus. Even though Simon actually established a Jewish state and was probably more in line with the Jewish Messiah, like I said, Jesus obviously has gone on to establish a much bigger and widely known and lasting legacy than Simon. So he will move on. In this one, I think, I don't even remember, what was going on with Theos again? This first guy. Man, it shows you just how fast this stuff just leaves your brain. Oh yeah, this guy's cult. I thought this was really interesting. I thought it was a really good insight into, like I was saying earlier, just how where this whole, these rituals and this worship of the dead thing comes from. It's very much the desire of, in many cases, it's very much the desire of the person being remembered. Of course, we know that's true with Cyrus the Great, the pharaohs, all of these guys. They're trying to establish the legacy. So yeah, I'm going to go with Roman emperors over Jesus. And I think we have to go with Jesus over the Roman emperors, simply because in a few hundred years from Caesar's time and Jesus' time, Christianity becomes the dominant religion of the Roman Empire, and thus, subsequently, the world. Which is interesting, since a lot of this began with the Jewish revolts against the Roman Empire. So this is an interesting one. This is kind of the West versus the East. This is the U.S. versus China. Man, what do we do here? I don't know. But I think we're just gonna have to go with Jesus. It's pretty obvious. I think his influence over the world, and this sets up a really interesting matchup here. So I think I am actually going to stop here now that I'm looking at this, because this is a great matchup to leave for the finals, and possibly go into a little deeper dive on these two figures and their role in not only historical events but even today, especially with Christianity today. Who are we holding up as higher at this moment? Is it Cyrus the Great or is it Jesus? I think that's a good question. So let's zoom back out. We are now at the end of the first division. This is where we are at, and this is where we are headed. So stay tuned next week for Division 2. These are the matchups that we will be seeing there. We have the Muhammad comes onto the scene, and so we have obviously Islamic prophets are now entering the fray. We have the continuation of Buddhism and Jewish messiahs. In this first division, we've only seen the Buddha himself, but there are others coming up. So stay tuned for that next week, and I hope to see you there. All right. Thanks for watching. Bye now.